Hello folks, evening. I feel as though I've drawn the short straw a little bit, kind of, because I don't know how a guy on a little bike designed for kids can kind of top somebody who's been up Everest. But I guess I've got some little prompt cards. I should probably get those out, shouldn't I? Oh. Just so you know, I've never kind of done this before, so for me it's kind of weird. But in fact, I've never really spoken about what I've done full stop. So that alone is quite a mini adventure for me in some ways. Micro adventures, that was kind of the topic that, that I was told was relevant to this evening in particular. And I was thinking about micro adventures, and I wondered kind of, well, what do you think they are? And I think in a way that the misconceptions, the preconceptions about what an adventure actually is, sometimes perhaps holds people back in their minds, if not physically. Strangely, just looking up there, I'm actually on a micro adventure there, which is a little bit ironic given that we've just seen photos of somebody scaling a mountain and going through great hardships. And there I am sat on a street, maybe looking like I'm asking for change perhaps. Although there were definitely times when I was significantly short of money, shall we say. But again, financial kind of means is not something that should stand in the way of pushing yourself and considering adventure possible. Perhaps we'll just move on. Am I in charge? I'm in charge of this, aren't I? So, right. This is actually me. I'm 11 there. 10 or 11 anyway, I think 11. And I'm actually on one of my micro adventures there, in fact. Probably one of my first. That was my rally burner bike back then, 83 I think that was. This bike was great because it got me out. It got me outside. And it got me thinking. It got me thinking creatively. It got me moving. It got me taking risks. Maybe even the first risks that I'd taken in my life, in fact. That's quite a big step, I think, for a young person. Taking risks, learning about risk. I often felt frustrated. I mean, I'm quite young there. The bike was quite heavy. It was a struggle sometimes. Couldn't really move it around the way I wanted to. I certainly wasn't part of any kind of cool group. There were a lot of older kids around. They were probably significantly better than I was. They maybe had nicer equipment. They certainly didn't have my homemade jumper. I think my gran knitted me that jumper, just so you know. And in fact, if truth be known, I'm looking, I'm thinking, do you know what? I think my gran made those trousers as well. So 11, when I first managed to get the bike off the ground, that was kind of like quite a big deal for me. And there was nobody around. And if I'm honest, it probably didn't come more than an inch off the ground. But it was quite a big step. It was a big step for me. And I think sometimes that it's small steps that really make the difference. Small steps are kind of the things that move you on in your life. 2, 3. Which, if I then skip forward kind of 20 years, this is actually the view from the judges' bench at the BMX World Championships in Prague, in the Czech Republic. On the left is actually the owner of, actually still one of the major BMX magazines. And on the right was a guy who pretty much started BMX, where it began in the Netherlands. And then there was me in the middle. And I think, to be honest, as I was taking the photo, I thought back to that first moment where my bike came off the ground an inch for the first time when I was 11. And the jump. And how in many ways the fact that the micro adventures in some respects had actually then taken me to this point. Yeah, I've written here, in fact, I began to realize, in fact, how micro adventures and my approach to them had in fact changed my life. Back to that. So back then, obviously, the internet, for example, it didn't exist, certainly when I was that age. Maybe it didn't for you either. So my role models in particular, they were quite limited. You know, I was from quite a small town in the north. My role models, I guess, were my parents, who taught me kind of right from wrong. They were my friends. They were, perhaps to an extent, the TV as well, but in a limited fashion. But I think those influences that I had, those role models, they actually taught me very little about myself. Or in fact, what I could do. Some of my friends' parents, for example, they were born and raised in that area. And some of my friends today, when I go back, they've never moved away. They're still there now. So there's quite a narrow view of the world that I had access to. And in fact, despite their support in some respects, my parents, they were quite supportive. I was lucky in that respect. But even then, they tried to encourage me to think in other directions, shall we say. It's perhaps not every parent's dream that their child arrives back bloody, covered in dirt, on a kid's bike, when perhaps they should be out looking for something more constructive to do with their lives. So even my parents, I pushed my parents perhaps to the limit of where parents would consider their son or daughter should reasonably be at that particular age. So I considered their advice, but I did in truth ignore it. As I think perhaps a lot of young people do. I'm not saying it's always a good thing to do, by the way, I'm just saying I ignored it. So although I think today the internet, for example, it provides quite a worldview, certainly a much bigger worldview than I had. It is a kind of a global picture of things. But I don't think anything has actually changed with regards finding out what you are capable of. You can see a lot, but whether it teaches you something about yourself, I'm not so sure. So taking a risk, or putting yourself out there with something different, it's often frowned upon. As I said, my parents, you know, perhaps the people who could have been behind me the most, also weren't entirely convinced that this was a viable path, shall we say, or indeed the best path for me, their son. So the idea that risk, actually just take a back step there. You've also, I guess, you've got the fear that something might go wrong. As you take risks, you have that fear that something could go wrong. You might even get hurt emotionally. You might get hurt physically. But I put here, in fact, that being and feeling alive is really important, and every moment of every day is, in fact, an opportunity to realize that. So I started to push my own boundaries, and I realized that actually there was only myself in the way. I think that's quite important. There was literally only me in the way. My fears, my restrictions, the boundaries that I placed on myself. So if I look differently at certain situations, if I worked with, and I've written here past my fears, and created an environment that allowed other things to happen, then they often did. And in a way, that creating of opportunities is again something that will only come if you put yourself in that situation, if you open up those possibilities. Yeah, other people and situations, they can place obstacles in your way, but at the end of the day, you make your own choices. You really do. Everybody makes their own choices every single day. I mean, obviously, I don't know if that's clear. That is me. I'm not really going to talk about those photos, to be honest. I'm going to switch to. Oh, I bet that starts automatically.
Like I'm just trying to do something. I fell 20 times.
I'm going to just mention this is a guy called Mike Brennan.
Stop, and the next day I can't walk.
Thank you. Yeah,
It starts
please.
to get a little old. I'm not 15 anymore.
Sorry, folks. I forgot it started automatically. Yeah, Mike is. He's from New Jersey, New York, and he's quite determined not to give up. And I saw Mike, and about in 2006, I liked his way of thinking. And I sponsored him to ride for the company that I was then representing. Because at the time, I was then international team manager for quite a large BMX company. And yeah, I like Mike's approach to life. And I started paying him to ride. And shortly after the video, he also got his own frame made for him. So he had his kind of, what's the word, signature frame made. Thanks.
Like I'm just